Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ilias Grampas, and on behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar on integrating science into the EU Green Deal. At the same time, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank hosting MEP Mr. Lins, Chair of Agri Committee, moreover the European Geosciences Union, EGU, for kindly co-organizing today's webinar. Prior to passing the floor, I would also like to let you know that at the end of every panel, we will host a Q&A session. So please make sure to send us your questions in written in advance via the control panel of the platform, indicating the speaker to whom your question is best addressed. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. Mr. Lins, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grampas. So dear colleagues, dear Mr. Montanari, dear ladies and gentlemen, the European Green Deal can Europe's man on the moon, according to my colleague Esther de Lange. Why and how? For such an ambitious goal, you need first vision. This we certainly have. And second, science. Because without a rocket, Europe's man will never make it to the moon. And in order to build the rocket, you need to listen to science and integrate the findings into the technology and the plan to make it to the moon. This is why it is so urgent to have this discussion today, because without science, we will not achieve our goal to become the first climate neutral continent in the world. As policymakers and politicians, our aim must also be to base our decisions on science and not on our ideology. Science as politics is a discourse, and there will never be the one and only solution or opinion. For this reason, I welcome this debate today, and I think it's crucial. The EU needs to be innovative, creative, and not restrictive. Instead of banning technologies and demonize certain sectors, it would be better to foster science and enable all actors to use innovation. Today, we will listen to the European Geoscience Union to learn what nature can do and how we can protect our planet while using its benefits to achieve our climate target. In two interesting panels, one on biodiversity and one on pollution, I'm looking forward to the discussion and input by science. This is what we are here for. So, without further delay, Mr. Montanari, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Lins. Good afternoon to all connected persons. Mr. Lins was effective already to illustrate the exciting opportunities that the Green Deal offers to Europe and Europeans. My job today is to introduce the panels and the discussion that will take place soon. My job is also to explain how we scientists, we researchers, intend to provide support to achieving the targets of the Green Deal. I must say that I'm very excited by this event. I think today we will get an interesting additional knowledge on how the Green Deal will materialize. I would like, before making the introduction of the panels, to first deliver a premise. And in particular, I would like to illustrate how the European Geosciences Union, the EGU, intends to support the strategy to get to the Green Deal targets. Let me start by saying that any policy to be effective needs to be supported by knowledge, education, and communication. We all know that. Policies are not much effective if they are imposed. They are effective if they are built by people. And the way we can get the support of people is precisely through education and communication. During the recent months, we have clearly seen during the pandemic that research plays an essential role to orchestrate the relationship between people and the environment. we have seen when and how research was successful. And we realized that our policies were successful when they were supported by research and when the research was able to gain public trust in science. This is the key. In my opinion, we were successful in mitigating the pandemics where communication and education were successful. Actually, the mission of EGU is precisely to provide the scientific basis and the education for sustainable development. This is why we think and we feel it's our duty to provide, to play an essential and a key role for achieving the Green Deal targets. The EGU is the leading organization in Europe for Earth, planetary and space science research. We count more than 20,000 members that span 22 different scientific divisions. We are really interdisciplinary, at least we aim to organize ourselves in this way. We are a non-profit organization, and I'm really proud to say that we are a bottom-up organization, as we are truly led by our members. Our keywords, in fact, are openness, inclusivity, diversity, equality, European integration, and finally, a positive attitude. We are convinced that science should adopt a positive attitude in order to better interact with people and policymakers. We are open to everybody. I would like to take this opportunity for encouraging the audience to contact us if they feel that they can provide a contribution to our research and finally to policymaking and the Green Deal. In fact, during the past 17 years, EGU was launched in 2003, we always supported open science, science communication, and science for policy. Through our open access journals, we are publishing 19 journals, scientific journals. We also provide support through webinars. We provide support through our General Assembly and educational initiative. In fact, we have an education committee and an outreach committee. The education committee in particular is dedicated to reaching out and provide support for education, for forming the future generation. We also organize events like this today to reach people and spread the word. You can understand that with such a potential of human resources, with such a potential of early career researcher and the support of the academia and in institutions dedicated to research, we feel it's our duty to provide support to policymakers, to provide support to sustainability, to reaching sustainability, and to try to engage with people and to provide our support in particular for achieving the Green Deal. Today, in particular, EGU aims to provide its contribution to knowledge, education and a communication for a green Europe, for a Europe to become a leader in sustainable development for the global benefit, because a leading Europe can provide significant support to reaching global benefit for humanity. So how can we do that in practice? Because it's important to materialize with actions the ideas and our motivation. First, let me explain that geosciences studies how living things, including humans, interact with the earth, with the environment. As a union, we support both blue skies research and applied research in geosciences. And we aim to address key societal and environmental challenges, including those outlined in the Green Deal. Let me put the accent on the importance of basic research, what we call blue skies research, which sets the basis for our knowledge. There is no applied research without fundamental research. Let's keep in mind that our knowledge of the environment is still limited. There is a lot of uncertainty still in our knowledge of how nature works. We at EGU see the Green Deal precisely as an applied strategy that needs to be supported by knowledge, namely fundamental and applied research. But let's go to the themes of today. We have two themes today to discuss. They are, as Mr. Lins mentioned, biodiversity and pollution. And we believe that we geoscientists can provide a fundamental support within this context. They are both, biodiversity and pollution, incredibly important for the environment and society, but are also complicated issue that needs strong policies based on science. I really appreciated the word by Mr. Lins in the opening, because we really think that the support of science to policymaking is the key to achieving such ambitious targets like climate neutrality. Today's event will include two panels, as Mr. Lins mentioned. The first panel will focus on how we can work together to achieve the aims outlined in the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And I think that in this context, interdisciplinarity and openness are essential ingredients. The second panel will discuss some of the things that should be addressed in the Green Deal's Zero Pollution Action Plan for Air, Water and Soil, to be adopted in 2021. This action plan aims to both prevent the generation of pollution and to implement measures to mitigate it. The panel, and this is our aim, in our vision, will embrace a range of perspectives, including policymakers, international organizations, industry representatives, and scientists, to make sure that we get here a range of different visions, a range of different ideas, and have an interesting discussion and synthesis. Now, a couple of announcements. To support the event and further outline how geosciences specifically can support the European Green Deal, the EGU is launching a document which, in our intention, should highlight key aspects that the geoscience community can support within the biodiversity and pollution policy areas. It means to provide examples of recent scientific breakthrough that may assist in meeting the Green Deal's targets. You can already access the digital version of the document in the chat box, but it will be also included in a follow-up email to this event. The second announcement, through this event, we are also hoping to promote greater interaction between policymakers and scientists. This is one of the main missions of the EGU. Networking opportunities in the past month have been limited since the start of the pandemic, but we are hoping to overcome this challenge. Indeed, the past month have shown us that in a virtual environment, we can still promote networking. And I also think that this gives additional opportunities to eliminate barriers to diversity and inclusivity. And now, how can we promote networking today? With the virtual networking happy hour, an event that will begin at 5:30. We invite all of the speakers and participants to join us for this more informal meeting that will enable us to continue the discussion in virtual breakout rooms of 5-6 people. There's a link that will be put into the chat box, maybe it's already there, so that you can register and join this session. It will last for about 1 hour. Okay, now it's time to get to the essence of today, and let me now introduce the first panel discussion, which I'm very honored to moderate. And again, I think these discussions will really provide for us a means to gain additional knowledge on the European Green Deal. As I said, this first panel discussion will focus on how we can work together to achieve the aims outlined in the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. Let me introduce very briefly our 4 panelists. The first speaker will be Norbert Lins. Welcome again. And he's a member of the European Parliament since 2014. Specifically, he is a member of the European People Party Group. Mr. Lins is also chair of the Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development. The second speaker will be Roby Biwer. Roby Biwer is rapporteur on the European Committee of the Region's Opinion, Biodiversity, Cities and Regions Beyond 2020 at the UN CBD COP15 and in the next EU strategy. Mr. Biwer is also member of the Bettembourg Municipal Council in Luxembourg. Luc Bass will follow up. Mr. Bass is the director of the EUCN European Regional Office in Brussels, representing EUCN towards the EU institutions and providing leadership and guidance for all activities undertaken by EUCN government and NGO members within the European context. The last speaker will be Iris Moeller. She is a professor of geography at Trinity College, Dublin. Mrs. Moeller is a coastal geomorphologist with a research focus on biophysical interaction in the intertidal zone, developing nature-based coastal defense solutions, monitoring, predicting long-term coastal morphodynamics, and the response of coastal systems to climate change. So you see that we are trying to gain a vision on all the main environments that are part of the framework within the Green Deal will be developed. I am now pleased to give the floor back to Mr. Norbert Lins.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Montanari. So, as we all know, biodiversity is crucial for the future of our planet, and we have to slow down its key drivers. And thanks to Mr. Montanari to point out what science can do. And this is why we now have the biodiversity strategy on the table. And there are a few things that I learned and will bring, and what I will bring into the discussion once we discuss this strategy in the European Parliament. And what I found of particular interest are three things. First, the network of protected areas. As you know, biodiversity 30% until 2030 and 10% strict protection. I think we need more data to choose the right areas for further protection. It is not simply about quantity or percentage. We need to protect the right areas, especially if we want to link the biodiversity aspect with the aspect of carbon sequestration. And then this leads me to my second interest, the forests. Maybe a little bit provocative, the impact assessment of the Commission on the new climate target outlined that the biggest fluctuation in the LULUCF sector derives from the fluctuation of the CO2 sequestration in forests. In terms of CO2, what's the best for forests? Letting them be or sustainable forest management? What is the benefit of old growth forests and CO2 things? And then the third one, it's soil. You said you could help with monitoring soil data to support the transition to more agroecological methods while ensuring yields. The Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy ask for a reduction of 50% pesticides and 20% fertilizers. In my opinion, a simple reduction of pesticides is not the solution, and the reduction in yield production is unavoidable if we simply apply a reduction target without offering helpful solutions and research on that topic. So my question is, what are the possible solutions? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lins. I just would like to remind all the participants, the attendants, that there will be a Q&A session at the end. I am now pleased to give the floor to Mr. Biwer. Please, Mr. Biwer.
Just to tell you that the Committee of the Regions is a consultative body of the EU representing local and regional authorities in bringing the voice of our communities and local level to the EU level. I want to thank Mr. Lins for hosting this event. The Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development is an important partner for the Committee of the Regions that participates to its advisory group. Local and regional authorities know very well the importance of the EU policies followed by the Intergroup and their practical impacts on the ground. As said rapporteur on biodiversity of the Committee of the Regions, I would be happy to contribute and to cooperate with the working group on biodiversity of the Intergroup and their chair, Mr. Lins. In biodiversity, the lack of expertise at the local administrative level is a well-known issue. It often prevents the implementation of biodiversity action in many cases. When, for example, a city council has to develop and implement a nature-based solution, it often faces a lack of knowledge and expertise. How can this be addressed? Well, we are working on this in cooperation with the European Commission as a follow-up to the opinion for which I am the rapporteur. But for example, in my region, we created an association of more than 50 municipalities working together on nature protection and restoration and combat biodiversity loss, thus creating synergies in manpower, in finance, in appropriate machineries, and in expertise, and realizing concrete projects on the ground. The Committee of the Regions is also very much committed to work on the Green Deal. We have set up a working group named Green Deal Going Local that aims at placing cities and regions at the core of the European Green Deal and ensure that both the EU's sustainable growth strategy and the COVID-19 recovery plan translate into direct funding for cities and regions and tangible projects for every territory. We are currently collecting local best practices connected with the Green Deal that will be able on our website. We are also preparing multiple opinions on the Green Deal and on its specific priorities. As a member of the working group, I will have the opportunity to bring to your inputs to my colleagues dealing with different aspects of the Green Deal. Science can play a fundamental role in making the Green Deal a reality on the ground, providing innovative solutions and producing available, reliable data that can strengthen the pressure to act in this sector. The Committee of the Regions particularly supports the integration of science in the daily evidence-based policymaking. We should, for example, map regional needs and do this scientifically, including modern technologies like supercomputing and satellite surveillance. Hence, all regions could be included. And we should encourage pilot projects supported by the European Parliament, like Science Meets Parliaments, Science Meets Regions, in order to further explore the link between science and the Green Deal challenges. Usually, research associations or climate NGOs focus on urbanized and peri-urban areas. However, the Committee of the Regions covers important topics such as demography, brain drain, migration, gender issues, and social inclusiveness, and all types of regions without exclusion should be the subject of research. Social sciences should not be forgotten. Many current societal challenges are far too complex for only one scientific discipline to deliver on. This is why technical solutions are often a precondition for a new policy outcome, but may not be sufficient to produce a meaningful societal impact, which also requires the insight of social sciences and humanities. On the environmental priorities of the Green Deal is the zero pollution ambition. In this context, in July, we have adopted 2 opinions on water policy and air policy. Both mentioned the importance of science. We have to also look at the major green challenges of the near and long-term future. Challenges like for instance, clean air, water shortages, soil, sea and ocean deterioration, deforestation. But science and knowledge has few added value without good communication, and we must succeed in awareness raising, sensibilization and acceptance by our citizens. Thus, still a lot of work ahead of us. So thank you all for your help and for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Biwer. Indeed, I think we are gaining a lot of food for thought, and once again, I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. I'm now pleased to give the floor to Mr. Luc Bas, Director, European Regional Office, EUCN. Please, Mr. Bas.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you for co-hosting this event, and thank you to Mr. Lins for hosting the event. I think it's a very timely event and very necessary. I also want to congratulate EGU on the report, which we will be looking at very carefully at ICN, because I'm sure it will hold some good opportunities to find solutions. And I think solutions is the big word that I've heard from many now, and how for the Green Deal, science and research can actually provide solutions, and maybe not just research for the sake of research, but really in the context of our societal needs and challenges. ICN is obviously a science-based or an evidence-based organization, and I will give you some illustration for that. And of course, everything what we do has to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So this notion of smart targets. And all the target setting in principle should be inspired, or at least based, but at least inspired on scientific evidence. Of course, if we would fully translate the targets that science is telling us, the ambition of both Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy and so many other environmental related strategies would actually be even much higher. So it's always an exercise of an equilibrium politically, societally, and at the environmental level. Just to show how important for us science and research is, before I will make some more provocative comments, is that what we do is of course very much based on it. We have 6 commissions at ICN, 6 scientific commissions on species, on protected areas, on ecosystems. We have a specific commission on environmental law and on communication and education. And so all of that is feeding into the work of ICN with its red list of threatened species, which is a basis for extinction risk, our categories of protected areas, which hopefully will be the inspiration to define what strict protection means in Europe, as it's been promised in the biodiversity strategy, but also to manage these areas properly. I mean, we have some good tool, scientifically based tool on which is called the green list of protected areas. One of the big threats, before I enter into the agricultural element, is the invasive alien species, and for which we have provided classification and taxa. And then maybe very important to bridge to the next level is the solutions. And I've heard Mr. Biwer talk about nature-based solutions. I think we are underusing those solutions, underinvesting in those solutions, but it also has to be clear what these solutions are. And ICN has just released a standard and guidelines on how to execute and how to develop nature-based solutions, which we hope will be the inspiration when we are seeking investment from the Green Deal in nature-based solutions. For ICN, it's really key that what we do is for and with nature, but also for the people and with people. So everything that we do has a social component to it. The societal challenge is one of the, or response to a societal challenge is one of the criteria in the nature-based solution. And I think it might also speak to the next speaker when she will be talking on coastal resilience. So science must go hand in hand with policy. We see that that is still not happening enough, but some promising signals are coming. For example, the Knowledge Center on Biodiversity that is going to be launched soon by the European Commission and for the European Union. So that is a good thing. And that will show also the leadership of the EU globally in the process to the post-2020 framework for biodiversity. And then maybe to bridge into where we are confronted with maybe not lacking all the knowledge, but at least bringing much of the knowledge together, is to how we can really change what is the biggest challenge in Europe for biodiversity, and I should say nature, because biodiversity is ultimately the indicator for healthy ecosystems, is to look at our unfortunately still very unsustainable land use, and more specifically agriculture, in which we have not been looking enough at the impact of biodiversity in nature. And I think science is clear about what should happen to the harmful subsidies that we're confronted with, and how we can tackle it. Of course, always in respect and making sure that the farmer has a decent and a good income, and that production is, of course, guaranteed. But some reduction in yield doesn't always have to be a drastic issue, especially when you look at the enormous amount of waste in the chain, in the whole chain that we create in the food system in Europe. So there's maybe some other argument that plays more quality instead of quantity, and for which nature-based solutions can provide some good inspiration. Maybe one final point about the two issues, or the two panels today, and the framing of it. It's interesting that we have one panel that is looking at biodiversity, which is, as I said earlier, high biodiversity means a healthy ecosystem and nature, and how we try to preserve that or to restore that. And on the other hand, we have a panel that is actually talking about a threat, which is the pollution to nature and to people and to health. So it's interesting how the framing is not really coinciding really, and I think we have to look at the threats, but then immediately look at what the solutions are and how we try to present these from a nature-based solutions perspective. Maybe really finally, a final point, and this is why we're so happy with this event, is that we have to still have to connect science closer with decision makers and with policy makers. We still see that there's too many scientists working in their own communities, which do a lot of applaudable work, but it has to get out there. It has to be policy relevant. It has to be put on the table in time for the policy decisions. It has to be embraced, and it has to be very well communicated to the public at large. And so, with all the ask and need for research, which we fully support, obviously, as we are a science-based organization, we should also be very careful, and I'm a bit responding to Mr. Lins's comment on the data needed to designate protected areas. I'm sure we can use more data and even designate better and find the best places. And for that, for example, the key biodiversity areas of ASEAN are yet another tool, but we should not wait until we have the perfect picture to then act. And the protection designation is just one. The management of those protected areas is even more important. And what we definitely not should do is wait until we have the perfect lens from science and from research to know where to restore nature in Europe, because we know at the moment so much that we hardly can actually comply to act what we need to act for. So let's be careful in the self-fulfilling prophecy for research before we act, and let's act now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Bas. Indeed, very stimulating, and I'm sure that we will have questions related with what you mentioned. Now I'm pleased to pass the floor to Professor Iris Moeller, Professor of Geography at Trinity College Dublin, and she's a researcher, and so we are going now to listen to the point of view of science. Please, Iris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Montanari, and thank you also, Mr. Lins, for hosting the session, and the previous speaker for a very related set of comments that are made there that will relate to what I am about to speak to you about. Now, I hope that my screen is all visible, and I will just move my windows about so that I can see it properly here. So the Green Deal, of course, is about improving the well-being of people and making Europe climate neutral by 2050. It's about protecting our natural habitat for people, the planet, the economy, and it's about leaving no one behind. Now, the important thing here is that we now have the science to know that environments, in my case and my research specialism, particularly coastal environments, as illustrated in the illustration you can see at the bottom of my screen. That science is able to provide the information we will need to manage those kinds of environments. And in the case of coastal environments, it's the capture of carbon, it's the enhancement of biodiversity, it's the mental and the physical health of people, it's providing recreational spaces, as well as being of immense commercial importance, particularly linking to agriculture and fisheries, but also in providing us with a natural buffer against extreme events. Now, within the European Union, 40% of the EU's population that we wish to bring with us on the Green Deal live in coastal regions. That is more than 500 million people. But our coastal regions are under intense pressure, not just from pollution. You will have all heard about the threat of sea level rise. You will be aware that sea level rise has accelerated in recent decades. And we live at a time in human history of unprecedented environmental change. Even if the EU becomes climate neutral by 2025, the legacy of the past will haunt us for many years to come, as sea levels will continue to rise for many more decades and centuries even. Now, alongside sea level rise, of course, we also have the science to know that extreme weather events, and thus coastal storms, will become more intense, if not more frequent. More intense and more frequent sea levels, together with coastal development, and often an increase in coastal development, is expected to increase annual flood damages by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude by 2100. I would argue that it is our scientific base that has provided us with this knowledge, but it is our economic priorities, our relatively short planning horizons, and what I would propose to call a control mindset that is responsible for an increased exposure and vulnerability of our society to sea level rise and extreme events. Now, as scientists, and particularly those working interdisciplinarily within the EGU, within my own discipline of geography, we have known for many years that, particularly at the coast, climate change plays out with great dynamism and complexity. Many factors, storms, waves, sea level, influence the coastal system, both indirectly from the marine side and from the landward side. And we only need to think about the Rhine River, the Danube, to appreciate how wide the spatial influence is that affects the coast, and also directly, of course. Ultimately, just like the weather, however, the system, as we now understand it, we know to be so complex that over the time periods over which we need to plan, and that is over the time of decades, we cannot think of this system as being fully predictable. As scientists, we know this. We know that we can't engineer ourselves out of the situation, but we also know that we can turn a threat into an opportunity, because we have learned that biodiversity and landforms are intricately connected. And this links into the comment made by the previous speaker about the need for space. We have learned that there's interconnectivity and that the biodiversity itself depends on a certain amount of dynamism. And what I would like to argue here, and what has emerged out of my 26 years of research into the flood protection benefits of natural coastal ecosystems, is that in fact the ecosystem depends on a landform, if you like, the brown context. The green biodiversity sits on top of that, and together it affects what you might think of as the blue, the waves, the tides, the surges, and that is an immediate buffering effect. That, of course, is important for transporting eroded material and for then building the natural buffer zone for us. So we know now that this requires, in effect, nothing other than space for these natural processes to operate. So where does science come in? If we want these processes to operate, we have to know where that space is needed at any particular point in time, and whether this is humanly possible, and whether we can be flexible with our occupation of the coast so that we can continue to benefit from all the benefits a naturally functioning coastal system gives us. We can perhaps be flexible with our occupation of space in some regions. If we don't understand the natural behavior of our coast, however, we end up with conservation strategies that quite literally reach their limits fairly quickly. And I wanted to just briefly introduce you to one quick case study here. This is on the east coast of the UK. This is Bennekeness, a site of special scientific interest, fantastically diverse dune systems, very wide beaches. And if we look at the remote sensing capability we now have, in this case, it's aerial photography. In many of our research, we're now using the EU's Copernicus satellite systems for similar sort of tracking information. We can observe that these dunes migrated of the order of kilometers between 1992 and 2016. And I don't know if you can see it well, but there's a stippled red line here on the right-hand side of this movie that is actually the northern limit, in this case here, north is on the left, of the SSSI, the Site of Special Scientific Interest. And the whole dune system has, over the last 30 to 50 years, in fact, migrated out of its area of protection. So what can we do? Well, we can prevent what has happened in the past. And this is an image not from the European Union, but this is an image from Colombia, Cartagena, in fact, provided by one of my PhD students who did her doctoral thesis out there. And this is a sand spit, just as dynamic as the dune area I showed you a minute ago. This is in 1945, and this is what this looked in 2000. What this looked like in 2006. So in the past, what has happened is that we have used the coastal proximity to advance our human actions and our human economy and our social systems. But we have done that, in fact, and put ourselves in harm's way of what is actually a completely natural dynamic system. And in doing that, we've brought ourselves into a vicious circle where the hazards have come back to bite us. So we can really look at this as scientists as two systems that, in the natural kind of way, the natural processes side of things, those environments are fully capable of adjusting to environmental change. We know that that is often now the case. What is the problem is that we have prevented those environments from doing that by encroaching upon them in a way that has become unsustainable. So my proposition is that we use the science we have, that we use the technology we have, including the remote sensing technology, digital environmental sensing technology, mobile phone transmission technology, and so on, to inform ourselves as best we can about the natural dynamism that we're facing that is supporting our biodiversity, and that together with that we cut the hazard vicious circle out, and we develop, in my case, it would be green coasts. So our science is increasingly telling us that our biodiverse, dynamic and complex natural processes can cope with environmental change if, and only if, we don't stand in their way and prevent them from doing so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moeller. Very inspiring. And now we got to our Q&A session. We got some interesting questions from the audience, but before passing the word to the audience, I would like to address myself a question to Mr. Lins. and it's related to the relationship between science and policymakers and politicians. As a scientific association, we try to get in touch with policymakers by organizing events like this, by organizing outreach activities, but still we would like to do something more. And do you have any suggestion how to strengthen the connection between research, which you emphasize it's important to provide support, and politics and policy making?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think that today we see there is more need for more interaction between politicians and scientists. Yeah, for us as politicians, it's often the question of time. Yeah? Do we have the time? There are always a lot of meetings. Maybe some of them are not really needed, yeah? But on the other side, it's really important to have the science in. So I would like to advise you or to recommend you to try to get more in touch with politicians, and I would do my best to be helpful when it comes to this question.
Thank you. I fully agree that often is really a question of time, and also this applies also to scientists. And sometimes we don't have enough time, and our activity to get connected to and to reach out are not recognized by, for instance, the academia. So this is another problem that we indeed must think of. I think that also academic recognition is something that needs to be revised if we really want to be interdisciplinary and connected. Now, there is a question from the audience. It's addressed to me, and the question is from Mr. Hans Pfeifenberger. And the question reads as, in order to protect biodiversity, one should of course have the facts about it. As to my knowledge, there are very few comprehensive global data sources on biodiversity, and one is gbif.org. The EU has helped this organization to get a better foothold and thus to data in Africa and South America. How can be that some EU countries, notably Italy, are not yet participants? First of all, let me say that I fully recognize the value of data. Data are essential, and we are very lucky that now we have we have more and more data. We have increasing databases that provide support to us. The problem is that sometimes they are not easily accessible. But coming to your specific question, which I think it is really interesting, let me say that I think we have a long way to go to build trust in science, in the public, and also in the politicians. And we have a long way to go to get the public and the politician recognizing the value of European integration. As you know, now we are in a period, in a time, where experience is not valued. Sometimes people believe more in the word of non-experienced persons than experienced ones. And sometimes there is no trust by the public and then the politicians in European strategies, and sometimes there is no trust in Europe. And this is also the case of Italy, not only Italy, I would say. And I think that our mission is precisely also to build a faith in European integration, to provide support to European integration. As a scientific union, we are very much committed to that, and to gain public trust in science and politics. And I think we have to really work together. We researchers, but also we politicians, we policymakers, we have to really work together to increase this trust. I think the reason, I'm not an expert on the specific issue that you mentioned, but I think the reason why Italy didn't join probably is because they don't see the value of a European database on biodiversity. And this is something that we really have to change. I fully agree with you. Now, there is another question from Eduardo Antonio Costantini to Luc Bass. Can you name some of the priorities of the nature-based solutions you have mentioned? So my take is, what are, in your opinion, examples of solutions that may be really effective?
Well, there's of course a very vast area of possibility and in very different ecosystems. I think the one that was amplified by Iris was on coastal ecosystems and the resilience there. So I think it's the two major pillars are restoration projects at large, and of course prioritizing where they should happen. And for that we have a restoration opportunity assessment methodology, which hasn't been used really in the European Union or in Europe. It has been very much used in the rest of the world, and we hope that with this Green Deal, this methodology might actually be embraced, and again, not being reinvented, because we are reinventing the wheel too often. So it is not just one size fits all. What is also important to mention is that it's not just restoration or renaturing, it's also really protecting. The protection of an area and properly managing the area can also be a nature-based solution. It has to be and has to have a societal benefit. For that, sometimes, of course, we have to start measuring ecosystem services better and natural capital accounting, but it should also, and it can also result in better health conditions, it can result in job creation, and these are very crucial elements in our standard, that the societal positive effect goes hand in hand with, but that is crucial, an increase in the level of biodiversity, because if there's no increase in the level of biodiversity, it is not a nature-based solution. But I can go on and on this, but I think with this, concrete examples would be taking us too far for this short opportunity, and I think Iris has actually very much demonstrated one ecosystem and biotype where it really works.
Yeah, I fully agree. Thank you very much. I'm now picking up a question from James Hingram to both Mr. Lins and Mr. Biwer. I would like to give the word to both of you. The question is, I would be interested to hear your perspectives on the biodiversity and farm-to-fork strategies. Are they sufficiently based on science? Do you see scientific arguments being undermined by interest groups? Indeed, an interesting question. So, Mr. Lins, I suggest.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you may know, I'm not only chair of the Agriculture Committee, but I'm a member of the EPP group in the European Parliament, and we were not very happy with the presentation of the Commission. We were not very happy with the date when the Commission presented the farm-to-fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy through the Corona crisis, and presenting a strategy with concrete percentages. What I mentioned before, the pesticide reduction, the antimicrobial, the target for organic farming, without an impact without an impact assessment. What is the impact not only on the agriculture sector? What is the impact on food security, and a lot of other questions. So there we were not very happy with. But percentages, for example, the 30% for biodiversity, the 10% strict protection, strictly protected areas. These are always political numbers or political percentages. And and now I think it could be the role of science to find out if these percentages are able to fulfill our biodiversity and our climate targets, or should we go for other percentages?
Thank you, Mr. Biwer.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the word Luc Bass said earlier on. I personally am very fond of scientific work, scientific data, but as politicians on local, regional, national, European level, we should not always hide behind a lack of knowledge, that we hide behind the fact that we only have 95% of knowledge or 95% of studies. We should act. We should really act on the ground. We should perhaps learn, backed up by scientists in the process. But if we wait and wait, we lose so much precious time. I think that as nature-based solutions, we are very well placed as local and regional authorities to implement nature-based solutions. But don't forget that beside nature-based solutions are mostly implemented in urban and peri-urban areas. We also have the pure nature outside in our landscapes that are as important as nature-based solutions. I'm fond of nature-based solutions, but I am afraid that often we forget those areas that are so much important to come up to 30% of nature protecting areas. The Farm to Fork initiatives is, in my opinion, a very good initiative, because we have, as I mentioned, created an association of about 50 municipalities, and we had started such an initiative where we involved our local farmers, and we assured them that they could produce locally and that we will use these local products in our school canteens, in our kindergartens. And I must say, those who participate to this Farm to Fork project of our municipalities, they are quite satisfied. And I think it's an example that should be shown around, and a good practice. So I hope that you understand that as local and regional authorities, we have the power, we have the possibilities to do good things, and with the help of scientists, also during the process in implementing such a project, we should go forward and not say we wait until we have the utmost last information from scientists.
Okay, I also would like to get the view of Professor Moeller on this question, especially because indeed I wanted to ask you, Iris, what do you think about science being politicized by interest groups? What is your take and your view on that? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think we have to be really careful as scientists to not become, it depends on what we understand politicized to mean, but I think it is our job to make sure that the insights that we gain through the science that we conduct make it out into the public domain in an understandable fashion. So when it's relevant to politics, when the science is relevant to policy, it has to be spoken about, it has to be communicated. And I don't think that in that case, then it becomes politicized science. It just becomes policy relevant science. So I would like to see us as scientists develop the skills to communicate science as policy relevant, and to find a way that we can be seen as what we are, and that is as individuals who, through our curiosity to discover how the natural environment works, how the human interaction with the natural environment works, and that is what drives us. We're not driven by policy, but what we do has policy relevance. And I think I was very grateful to your comments earlier about the necessity to have the scientific endeavour in this regard be more recognised within academic circles, and also for scientists to become better trained at understanding how that communication is possible. I believe that communication is possible without being understood as being politicised. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes, very much so. I really like the conclusion, and I fully 100% agree. And I think this could be a question that I can turn to the other panelists with 20 seconds each, also because it was asked from one of the attendants, Jorg Ventosilla. So in 20 seconds each, how to prevent science for being ignored or even worse, politicized. So what do you think we should learn from the past to avoid to repeat the mistake during the Green Deal period? So very briefly, and I would let's start with Mr. Lins with the order of the speakers.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it's really neat that we have more interaction, but on the other side I think scientists should be careful to be involved in campaigns or misused, yeah, from each political side. And that's so in the past I saw some examples that they were misused, and that's at the end not good for science and not good for the political debate.
Fully agreed. Mr. Bass or Mr. Biwer? It's Mr. Bass.
Okay, well, it's interesting indeed that in some cases science is fully ignored, and unfortunately we see this even with our biggest challenge, which is the climate change challenge. So we are not answering what science is telling us and what we need to do, which is a little bit understandable because it's such a huge challenge, and the reductions that are needed on CO2 are really enormous. And the same goes for making sure that our agricultural system becomes sustainable. And it is a challenge for farmers, and we need to do this with the farmers. There needs to be a just transition, but we know what we need to do, and we still ignore it. And on the other hand, there is forces that are spreading doubt about some scientific results and claim that they are not ready, that they're not sufficient, and then there's no action. And so it's being used from two sides by different spectra in the political field, and that is something that I think is the biggest risk. So what to do about it is to be concise, not too complicated, and to always think in solutions when you present your results from your scientific research.
Okay, Mr. Biwer, very much agreed. Mr. Biwer?
Yeah, I think that science and the academia has so far done a very good job about all these matters we are talking about, biodiversity loss and climate change. And I think that we know nearly everything what we should do, and we have all of us combat the fake news, let's call it like that, about scientific facts. People, political groups using data that are not common sense by the large majority of scientists, just to their own political or private profit. So we have to combat this and succeed in saying clearly to our citizens what is scientific fact and not fake news.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. I would like to ask Professor Moeller to give a closing remark with a short answer to this question. What would you suggest to early career scientists, perhaps one of your students, to provide motivation to engage in communication and in getting connected with policymakers? This is a question that I always ask myself, and how can I motivate my students to dedicate energy to that? What is your suggestion to close this interesting discussion?
I think I would make two key points there. One that relates to the previous discussion, and that is about we're really at the beginning of a revolution, I think, and it's a data revolution and an open data revolution. And I think that through programs like the EU's Copernicus program I mentioned in my presentation, through the use of open digital media and acquisition of the state of the environment digitally, I see my students and early career researchers now go out and produce animations, easily understandable graphics that are based on the data that is provided via these kinds of sources. That is, so they are fact-based ways of communication that also are, that they tie into the social media, we're now all living through, and the explosion of social media. And I see some of the early career researchers do a very good job in that, and I see them being listened to. And I would also say to them that to invest energy into that, in my view, even though perhaps within academia that is not always recognized as in terms of their career progression, in my experience, it has always led to a building of a network that has been stimulating, interesting, has driven my own questioning and science in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise have thought would be possible. And so I think, it is a two-way interaction, and I think it is really important.
Thank you. Very interesting. And now it's time to close this interesting discussion. And I really believe that we gained for our panel. I really believe that we gained some very useful indications. And I'm sorry that I couldn't address all the questions from the audience, but I hope that the audience and maybe some of the speakers will take the opportunity to join the happy hour where we can continue the discussion. I'm now passing the floor to Helen Glaves. Helen Glaves is currently Vice President of the EGU. She will become President of the Union in 2021 and will be the President up to 2023. Helen is a Senior Data Scientist at the British Geological Survey. Helen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and thank you to all the panelists from the previous session. That was such an interesting session. I really learned a lot from the speakers, so I also would like to add my thanks to all of the speakers in the previous session. That was really interesting. So we're going to move on to the second panel this afternoon, which is focused around the Green Deal Zero Pollution Action Plan for air, water and soil, which will be adopted in 2021. And interestingly enough, in the panel discussion that we've just had, we've already touched on pollution and the impact on biodiversity. So I think it is very appropriate that we now move on to discuss another facet of the Green Deal. One of the things that I think came out very strongly from the last panel was the importance of collaboration across sectors and the wide range of disciplines that need to be involved. But I think also Mr. Montanari very much emphasized the importance of integration and intersection between science and policy and how important this is going to be for realizing the Green Deal. And I think it's worth mentioning that geosciences is just one of the many disciplines that are going to provide the crucial scientific evidence that is necessary to underpin the robust policies that will be needed to actually realize the Green Deal in the future. I think one of the things that I would like to highlight is the fact that we do all need to work together in order to achieve the objectives of the Green Deal. That's a very strong message that's come out of this webinar, and I think it's very evident from reading the Green Deal document that both science and policy and society all need to come together to achieve the very ambitious goals of the Green Deal. But I, for one, am incredibly optimistic that we can achieve many of the goals, if not all of the goals identified in the Green Deal. So moving on, I'd like to introduce today's panel. And I would like to apologise to some of the panellists in advance if I get the pronunciation of your names wrong. Please do feel free to correct me at the appropriate moment if I've mispronounced your name. So our panellists today are Mr. Mohammed Chahim, who is a member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands, specifically as a member of the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Mr. Chahim is also Vice Chair of the Committee of Inquiry on the Protection of Animals during Transport. Our second panellist is Anna Papagrigoraki, who is the Sustainability Director for the Confederation of European Paper Industries, which is a pan-European association representing forest fibre and paper industries. Our third panellist is Dr. Erik van Sebille. He is Associate Professor at the Institute of Marine and Atmospheric Research and Department of Physics at Utrecht University. So I would now like to hand the floor to the first of our speakers, who is Mr. Chahim. Mr. Chahim, if you'd like to make your presentation.
Hello, I'm trying to open up my camera so everyone can see me. Miss Glaves, thank you. Takes some time, I think, for the camera to... But I think everyone can hear me at least.
Yes, we can. I understand your challenges with the camera. I have a similar one, so hopefully we'll see you in the end, but we can hear you very well.
Exactly. So first of all, I have to say thanks for the organization of this session. I think it's very important to integrate science into the Green Deal, into the so think of ways how to, in a most effective way, cost-efficient way, smart way, reach the goals that we all have set in the European Green Deal, and especially also in the climate law that will be voted in the next session of the European Parliament next week. I'm very passionate about science. Before my life as an MEP, I was a scientist as the Dutch Organization of Applied Scientific Research, TNO, one of the bigger research institutes. And I do believe that without incorporating science, without the right research and innovation, it will be very difficult to reach the climate neutrality goal that we have set for 2050. I do believe that the 55% or 65% target, we can get there with a lot of the current known technologies that already have a high TRL level, but really to get to the climate neutrality, still a lot of research and innovation is needed. That's why I'm also a bit disappointed about the European Council that have cut basically a big share of the research and innovation funds we have at the European stage. I was a couple of weeks ago. I was in a conference with a Horizon 2020 final conference. It was called DEEDS, and DEEDS is about what do we need to do from a scientific perspective, from a research and innovation perspective, to make sure. Sorry, to make sure I'm visible. I can see, to make sure that we make sure that the climate goals are met. And one of the very interesting conclusions they had was that if you look at global research and innovation expenditure, that it has a direct effect on the cost of mitigation. Basically, the cost of mitigation is reduced by our research and innovation from 2.4% of global reference GDP to 1.2%. That's a big cost decrease. So I do believe with investing in the right policies, with making sure we, from a very broad perspective, when it comes to making sure we meet our climate targets, I think research and innovation plays a big role. And it's not only from an energy perspective, but also, as was discussed in the previous panel, when it comes to natural-based solution, when it comes to improving biodiversity, land use change, and forestry. I think also there we can be very successful in making sure that the planet copes in a better way with the changes we have caused in the last centuries. I'm very curious about my two colleague panelists, Anna Papagrigoraki and Erik van Sebille. They represent, I think, the scientific world. I'm very interested to hear what they say, and me as a member of parliament, I'm always open to hear good suggestions from the field, from industry, from scientific world, from innovation RTO companies, and see to what extent I can incorporate their ideas into policies that we create within the parliament. So I think that's it for me. I'll give back the word to Helen, Glaves, and then we'll meet again at the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chahim. A really interesting way to open this panel. I'd just like to take a moment to remind the participants, if you have questions for our panelists, please do pop them in the chat, and then I will be able to put them to our panelists during our Q&A session at the end of the panel. So we're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Anna Papagrigoraki. Anna, if I can pass to you, and again, apologies if I mispronounced your last name.
Oh, that's all right, Helen. Don't worry about it. I myself cannot pronounce it correctly sometimes. Everybody calls me Anna. So it's lovely to be here. And yes, as mentioned before by Helen, I represent the European Confederation of Paper Industries, or otherwise known as SEPI. Now, I must say that the topic at hand is a very challenging topic and requires very careful considerations. What I will zoom in when we think about data, when we think about numbers. So we represent 891 mills, paper mills, across Europe. And the reason why I'm talking about 891 mills is because I'm thinking about industrial installations. Now, the reason why I use the word industrial installations is because at the end of the day, the Zero Pollution Action Plan goes hand in hand with the revision of the Industrial Emissions Directive. And that could mean stricter emission limit values. That is part of the plan. It will affect the permits, but it will also affect what is being produced. So when we look at the membership of SEPI, when we look at our companies, they transform pulpwood, so wood fibers linked to the forest, as you understand, into cellulose and bio-based products. So more than 92% of our raw materials are sourced in Europe and certified, also sustainable. Now, we do play a vital part in the circular bioeconomy, and we do provide consumers with a range of renewable and recyclable solutions for packaging, different types of papers, specialty papers, textiles, biocomposites, biochemicals, and energy products. Now, none of these innovative solutions would be possible without science via research and innovation. And in a way, when you have to communicate about, when you have to communicate to policymakers, but also to the rest of the influencers in the Brussels bubble, but also outside, communication has to be fact-based and science-based. So good policymaking regulation requires accurate and updated data. And our own stakeholders ask for robust and reliable data on all sustainability aspects. Companies also need data in turn in business intelligence to support their strategy, investments, and decision making. And before I go back to the discussion about industrial installations, I'd just like to give you an example of the support of science to the green policies and the Green Deal. So SEPI published a study on the climate effect of the forest-based sector in the European Union, where it calculated the substitution effect, which consists of preventing CO2 emissions moving away from fossil-based materials. It couples it with existing data on process emissions. CO2 removed by the forest, and the CO2 stored in forest products. The results show that forests and forest-based products remove a net of 806 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents annually, which is around roughly 20% of all fossil emissions in the European Union. But then if we zoom back into technologies, so finding innovative breakthrough technologies would also be key to further reducing other emissions to water and air towards the zero emission objective, but also the zero pollution action plan. But you must also bear in mind that when we think about industrial installation, it's not just about what happens within the plant. It's just not what is written on the permit. So BOD emissions from the wastewater treatment plant. It's also how will the market and policy landscape impact what is produced in the plant. So if you have to adapt to policy, to the circular economy, and do different kinds of packaging or different kinds of textiles, your plant will be the first one that will be affected. So your wastewater treatment system will be affected. Your choices of energy efficiency investments will affect it. It's a little bit like a puzzle, isn't it? Or a bit like a domino. You change one thing and then something else changes. So this is something where science can definitely help to show how does one change affect the emissions in another site. So how does a change in energy efficiency technology change emissions to water? That's something we'd love to know. And at the same time, we do fully understand that time must be given for science to produce reproducible and reliable results, which will also provide legislative predictability to industry. But that is, of course, the result of accurate and reliable data. At the same time, it also feels significant to pinpoint areas where science could clarify policy further. So if we look at the product's environmental footprint, if we look at life cycle assessment, this is a carbon accounting methodology that policymakers and businesses, including us, are using it. We have actually developed a product environmental footprint SME tool for intermediate paper products. But of course, in order for this to go into policy, in order for this to go into the green claims in a legislative proposal, if there are certain impact categories that need to be more accurately depicted, this is where science comes in. And I'm mostly thinking of land use. But I'll stop here for now, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I'm assuming people can see my screen.
Yes, hello, Erik. Let me just introduce you on behalf of the AP Intergroup Secretariat. So right next we have Mr. Van Sebille. Erik is Associate Professor in Oceanography and Climate Change at the Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research, Department of Physics in Utrecht University, Netherlands. So Erik, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for a really, really interesting session. And as last speaker, I now have to kind of wrap it all up. So I am an oceanographer. I call myself an ocean scientist, which is a part of geoscience. And specifically, what I focus on is how ocean currents move stuff around. Now, that's stuff that can be anything from plankton and fish to things like sargassum. And most importantly now, of course, the plastic that is littering our ocean and for which, of course, is part of this session about pollution. Now, what you see here on this map is actually data from the ocean. These are the trajectories of drifters in the Atlantic Ocean. As you see, all these different little lines represent one single drifter. And it's up to us as scientists to take this data, which has been generated through international collaborations between the US, Europe, Japan, all nations around the world, to take this data and to use it to say something meaningful about the challenges that we face and the solutions that are part of the Green Deal. Now, my work these days specifically focuses about ocean plastic pollution, and I do this within an ERC starting grant, tracking of plastics in our seas, topios.org, which is now 3/4 of the way in or so. And I wanted to highlight that this is an ERC funding. So this is meant for blue skies research, which I'm very fortunate to have, which I have used a lot of, and which has been a fantastic project, but it's also gone towards solutions. So the ERC in some ways, even though it is often thought of as more blue skies, is very relevant also for problems and for solutions to those problems. Now, I work on where plastic is, how plastic moves through the ocean, how it goes around. And of course, when I talk about this, I very often immediately get people's reactions about the island of plastic somewhere in the ocean. In fact, this mythical island is so popular and infamous now that it even was part of a Donald Duck cartoon in the Netherlands. And here it's in Dutch, but I've translated it for you. Essentially, Donald and his nephews and his uncle land upon this fantastically big amount of plastic somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The problem is that this is not true. There is no island of trash somewhere in the ocean. And that also means that we can't just go out there and clean it up. We can't go there, go out with a ship and just take all this trash like Donald here does, because the plastic is much, much more smaller than that. It is much more diffuse. It is much more spread around in the ocean. In fact, when people think about plastic in the ocean, they think about the big stuff. They think about the nets and the large pieces of plastic that indeed sometimes you find in the ocean, but that are very often very sparse. What is a much more better mental image of what the plastic in the ocean looks like is actually this. It's somewhat boring, I agree, but it's essentially the content of a net trawl through the middle of the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and California, where most of the plastic floats around. And if you trawl for almost 2 kilometers through the ocean, then you find this, a petri dish full of tiny pieces of plastic. The point is that by the time that the plastic finally arrives here in the middle of the gyre, it has been degraded so much, it is so much smaller that it is almost impossible to take out. And even if you could filter all this plastic out of the ocean, then probably we'll also be filtering out a lot of the life that is around it. Think about the bacteria, think about the plankton, think about the fish eggs that float along with all this plastic. So if we want to think about solutions to the plastic soup problem, then we shouldn't really be focusing on the big stuff in the middle of the ocean. Instead, and we did some scientific work on this, if we do really want to remove plastic from the ocean, then it is most effective to do it in all the locations where you see a black dot here. Those are situated around Southeast Asia in particular, in the Mediterranean, and indeed just off the Thames and or Rhine estuary in the North Sea. Because if you take the plastic out there, it's much more efficient, it's much more effective before the plastic moves through the ocean. Of course, prevention is better than curing, and that is also true for plastic in the ocean. So if you want to take it out, do it close to the coastline. Now, we are able to do this kind of work to figure out where most effectively to take out the plastic, because we actually have digital twin oceans. So this is a notion, or we have already models of our ocean in which we can simulate how the plastic moves through it. And by building upon those, by extending those into a full, what's often called a ocean 5D, a ocean that is not only used for science, a virtual ocean that is also used for education, for the private sector, for science, for all kinds of other things. We can create this digital twin ocean as part also of the science in the new Green Deal, where we can test out solutions. I think that is the key point that I want to discuss here, is that if we ever wanted to put out a solution, then better first to test drive it in a virtual twin Earth, a virtual twin ocean in case of ocean pollution, a virtual twin atmosphere in the case of atmospheric pollution. These type of tools can really make sure that our solutions actually are supported by science, and that in the end is, I think, what we want. Thank you very much.
That was great, Erik. I really enjoyed your presentation. My background these days is in geoinformatics, so I was really encouraged to see in the Green Deal document the comments about creating a digital Earth model as part of the objectives and the science objectives to support the Green Deal. So your presentation that looked at the concept of digital twins, I think, sort of very much resonated with me. So thank you for that. I have a few questions that I'm going to put to the panelists. I'm actually going to start with a question from Tony Clem to Anna Papagrigoraki. And the question is, how does the European paper industry see, and this could be opposition or support, the EU's target to plant 3 billion trees by 2030? And does it affect its businesses? And if yes, how?
Okay, so I think when we look at that target, we do believe it is positive that the Commission has this target. But of course, afforestation is important. Regeneration of harvested areas is part of sustainable forest management, so that should not be forgotten. And of course, what we should also consider is it's not about just planting the forest. It's, like I said, it's about regenerating it, but it's also about how you make use of the raw material. So if we look at the wood, the idea is to take advantage of the entire raw material, including the residues, because the target has to be in line with the circular economy, and the forest-based products do have a low carbon potential. So it is key to put the investments in low carbon forest-based products.
That's great. Thank you, Anna. I really appreciated your response, because I just to wrap up this session, because I'm conscious we are running a little bit over time, I actually wanted to put a question to all of the panelists around what you see as the benefits and the possible drawbacks of the circular economy. To a certain extent, I guess, Anna, you've already answered this question, but I would like to hear perhaps from Mr. Chahim and from Dr. van Sebille, what their view is, perhaps starting with Mr. Chahim.
So, sorry, again, on the circular economy, to what extent the circular economy can contribute to the climate, to the gap? Well,
to the objectives of the Green Deal.
Yeah, I once saw a study that it could close, I think, at least, was it 2/3 of the gap between the pledges and the national energy and climate plans. But in order to have a good circular economy, I also discussed this a couple of weeks ago with a journalist when the Financial Times or the New York Times wrote that article on the raw material strategy of the European Commission. It's not only good to identify these raw materials, it's also, I think, very important to create production facilities or an industry where you at least know in which kind of products all these raw materials exist and how you can reuse them, how you can in a more efficient way reuse this product, reuse them in maybe other products. So the first step is identify these critical materials or scarce materials or whatever the Commission calls them, but it's also important to have a strategy how to extend the lifetime, where can they found. I mean, there's a debate on whether we should implement the product passport, where we know which type of materials can be found in which type of products and how we can reuse them or how we can identify them. I mean, this is all necessary in order to decrease our dependency from certain countries. I mean, this is very important, and the energy transition will not succeed if we cannot create a certain independence in Europe when it comes to these type of materials, because we're going from a fossil fuel dependence to a raw material dependence, and I don't think that's the smart move. So for me, it's good to have this list and identify them. I would like to do this together with industry and the scientific community, but then we also have to think of ways how we can better make use of these products, because I mean, I don't have to tell you that also mining of these products and not using them efficiently, we're not using them as efficient as we're doing now, also can affect CO2 emissions drastically. So it's always better to reuse products or reuse materials instead of mining and having new fresh raw materials. So to that extent, I think the Commission strategy is step one, and I'm really curious to what extent we can incentivize industry and come up with all these bright solutions that the scientific community comes up with in order to be less raw material dependent and at the same time decrease our emissions there. So that would be my answer.
Thank you very much. And you actually have just answered my supplementary question, which was going to be what incentives do we need to put in place to get industry to actually adopt some of these practices so that we can, for example, discourage built-in obsolescence in household white goods, etc.
Yeah. But to be honest, there are some laws, there are some regulations that block these initiatives. For example, when I was working as a scientist, we had this idea to revalue buildings in a different way, really look at materials and products that exist in these values. But then from a tax perspective, there was no incentive in doing that, because when you do that, you revalue your building in a different way, and then you cannot benefit from a tax perspective. So it's some fiscal laws or regulations in the Netherlands were blocking basically revaluating, but also having higher rest value or end of life value of certain products. So this is quite common. Also, the waste directive of the European in Europe also blocks initiatives to improve the reuse and more efficient use of certain materials, because the moment a product gets the classification of waste, a big bureaucratic mechanism is triggered, and it's almost impossible for companies that really have the right intention to reuse products or at least the materials, but then they're blocked because of either European or national regulations. So we also have to look careful at all the rules and regulations that we are creating and the directives, and to see to what extent these rules are blocking the incentive for companies to really move forward when it comes to better use of our materials.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And Erik, I'm going to ask you just to give your view, just to wrap up this panel discussion. So, Erik.
Yeah, so the circular economy, you can't be against it, right? I mean, if you would start all over again and figure out what an economy looks like, then of course we would design it as a circular economy. So the problem is not that we don't want to get to a circular economy. The question is, how do we get there? And what are the innovations and the science that we need for that? And that is really, really challenging. For example, for plastic, what my expertise is, I know the Dutch Statistics Bureau released a report 2 years ago where they showed that the chance of a piece of plastic ending up in the ocean is just as big whether you throw it in the recycling bin as whether you throw it in a normal waste stream. So that's quite shocking, because it means that if you care about your plastic not ending up in the ocean, it doesn't really matter whether you recycle or not. And that is and there's all kinds of reasons behind it, including that if you put plastic in a waste stream, then it just gets incinerated and it never ever has a chance to get into the ocean. But it does show that it's not only about innovation, it's also about communication and about being very clear about what do we expect, what are the expectations, what can people expect when they recycle their stuff. And it is about design. It is about helping in product design, designing for the circular economy. And I think that if these two are also in place, together with all the innovation, all the technology, then I think that we as Europe are at a unique position to get ahead here and to really do some innovative stuff and lead the world in this.
Thank you. Erik, I really appreciate your comments to wrap this this really interesting discussion up. And I'm just sorry we don't have more time to discuss this within this framework right now. But just to remind you, there will be, we're having an informal happy hour after this for those of you who can join. I think the link to register and join will be dropped into the chat if it's not already there. And it'll be an opportunity for us to perhaps continue some of these discussions. I certainly would be very interested to have a further discussion about the Circular Economy Action Plan and the vision for the future. I want to take this opportunity to thank all three of you very much for your time and your insight as part of this webinar. I think it's been very informative for everybody participating. At this point, I have the opportunity to introduce Mr. Stelios Kympouropoulos. And again, I apologize for my poor presentation. Fine, thank you, Mohammed. So it's the opportunity for him to give us a reaction to what he's heard during this webinar today. Mr. Kympouropoulos is a member of the European Parliament. He's also sits on the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs. I'm glad to be able to see him on the screen now. I was a little bit concerned he might not actually be here at the moment. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that he's also importantly co-founder of the Independent Living Organisation of Greece. This is the first organisation that promotes independent living in Greece. So I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Kympouropoulos, and I hope he'll correct me on the pronunciation of his last name, who will give a response to the contributions that he's heard from our speakers today. So Mr. Kympouropoulos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helen. You pronounce very well my last name. Do you hear me?
We can, yes.
Thank you. So, dear Lins, dear colleagues, dear speakers and participants, firstly, I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this interesting event and congratulate each of you for its efforts and scientific contribution. After so much science, let's talk again about politics. As we all know, the EU aims to become climate neutral in 2050. We proposed a European climate law to turn this political commitment into a legal obligation. Reaching this target will require action by all sectors of our economy, including investing in environmentally friendly technologies, supporting the industry to innovate, rolling out cleaner, cheaper, and healthier forms of private and public transport, decarbonizing the energy sector, ensuring buildings are more energy efficient, working with international partners to improve global environmental standards. Becoming the world's first climate neutral economy by 2050 is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to modernize the EU's economy and society and reorient them towards a just and sustainable future. My experience as a medical doctor showed me that science works as a catalyst for any innovative policy and step forward, and thus science and innovation will play a central role in accelerating and navigating the necessary transitions, deploying, demonstrating, and risking solutions, engaging citizens in social innovation. The European Green Deal is our plan to make the EU's economy sustainable. We can do this by turning climate and environmental challenges into opportunities and making the decision just and inclusive for all. The plan is ambitious and will affect nearly every aspect of the EU's economy. Its existing law will be reviewed on its climate merits, and new legislation will be introduced on the circular economy, building renovation, biodiversity, farming, and innovation. The main policy areas are clean energy, sustainable industry, building and innovation, farm to fork, eliminating pollution, sustainable mobility, and biodiversity. One of the pillars of the European Green Deal is to stimulate innovation-based competitiveness. The significant potential in global markets for low-emission technologies, sustainable products, and services offers the opportunity to expand sustainable and job-intensive economic activity based on inclusive growth. The European Green Deal accelerates the transition. The approach is directed toward the market parties. It will, for example, support workers to develop skills and competence for the job markets of the future and help entrepreneurs and incubators to create new economic opportunities. It will boost investment in clean energy. The overall goal is to stimulate economic innovation by supporting startups, scale-ups, and SMEs. The Green Deal strategy will have to involve citizens, workers, entrepreneurs, researchers, and farmers to shape a new relationship between growth, environment, and carbon emissions. The European Commission must not only set targets, but also draw a clear political pathway to implement those targets and secure the financial capacity to support economic, social, and environmental transition with concrete and new financial resources. Today, we discussed many drastic ideas and scientific views for two different subjects in the framework of the Green Deal. I have some comments on the paper speeches. I fully agree with Mr. Biwer that Green Deal is essential to protect biodiversity, nature, and forests, and at the same time protect our daily life. As a member of REGI committee, I'm witness of many concerns from mayors on how they can implement Green Deal in local level and which is the most appropriate technology for the region. This is the main reason why science should play an important role in green transition. Finally, we need to fully engage all local and regional authorities if we want to see tangible results on air pollution, sea pollution, and global warming. As it has been mentioned for this project, we need collaborations. Europe needs all parties to come in consensus as close as to the target of a neutral emissions European Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kympouropoulos, for highlighting all those topics of key importance when it comes to concrete solutions within the EU Green Deal, but also for underlining the added value of the science policy nexus. At the same time, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all of the panelists and previous speakers. At this stage, I think that your intervention has wrapped up perfectly our event for the past 2 hours. With no further ado, I'd just like to pass the floor to Mr. Lins for his closing remarks of today's event. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Grampas, for organizing this event. Thank you. Thanks to all of the panelists, to all of the speakers, colleagues from the European Parliament. I think it was a first very interesting discussion on how we can introduce science into the Green Deal, and thanks to the European Geoscience Union for not only being part of this discussion. I think it was very helpful for us as a politician when it comes to our discussion within the European Parliament on the Green Deal, especially on the farm to fork and the biodiversity strategy. And I think this was only an opening event, and we as Intergroup will continue this discussion with science in the upcoming months. And so I want to thank all of you. I think this was a very good starting point, and I wish you a very nice evening, and hopefully see you at the next event of this Intergroup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lins. Also on behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup, I would also like to thank you once again for hosting today's webinar. It's been a real pleasure having this event with you all today. I hope you also enjoyed it, while we're very much looking forward to welcoming you at our upcoming events to follow. Until then, all the best and stay safe. See you soon.